Thymesia is a game that attempts to ask and answer one simple question. What if Sekiro was a plague doctor that dabbled in alchemy instead of the ninja arts? In all seriousness, Thymesia is a Souls-like that released earlier this year that takes more than a few notes out of Sekiro's book in terms of gameplay, while giving us a plot that takes place in a plague-ridden kingdom drawn up from the memories of our beak-masked protagonist. This first effort from indie developer Overborders Studio shows a lot of promise, even with a number of shortcomings, and it just might be able to satisfy the urge we all have to delve into a new Souls-like. My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Thymesia. Thymesia casts you as Corvus, an amnesiac alchemist who is attempting to piece together the memories of his shrouded past. And I mean piece together his memories quite literally, as each mission has you diving into Corvus's memories to find the key to ridding the kingdom of Hermes from a debilitating plague. The plot is fed to you through numerous notes you'll find scattered throughout each level, and despite their simplicity in nature, I was still confused as to what the hell was going on by the end of the game. Pair that with your typical cryptic NPCs, and this honestly just adds up to your average Souls-like plot experience. Not good, not bad, but it's very much left up to the player to seek the knowledge out and discern the plot for themselves. Or you can simply Google Thymesia plot and let some nerd on Reddit figure it out for you. Anyway, the story takes a mission-based approach, somewhat similar to the Neo series, where you'll play through a main mission for each level, which will then open up several submissions that take you through a rearranged version of the same level. I did like that these submissions had an impact on the plot and offered a lot of key rewards to strengthen Corvus's abilities. Too often, games will offer you several optional quests that have no real value to the game other than to pad the overall playtime, so it's always nice to see side content that is actually worth doing. As for the setting, the Kingdom of Hermes offers 3 unique zones to explore, which are very dark and very Bloodborne inspired. Some do feel kind of flat and boring though, like the Hermes Fortress, which is just your average, well, stone fortress. The Sea of Trees, on the other hand, oozes with character with its plague-addled circus aesthetic. The verticality of the level makes you feel like you're rising to the top of a circus tent as the main attraction in some twisted act. And since this is the game's very first full zone you'll explore, Thymesia does give you a strong first impression with its setting that unfortunately the other 2 zones don't live up to. But there's clearly a ray of brilliance from the developers with the Sea of Trees, and I sincerely hope we get to see it again in a future sequel. When I first saw gameplay of Thymesia, I honestly thought that the Sekiro comparisons seemed pretty silly, as it looked like they had nothing in common. But it didn't take long for me to realize how accurate this comparison was when I started playing for the first time, because, much like Sekiro, Thymesia takes more of a rock-paper-scissors approach to combat. Sure, attacks can certainly be dodged like any other Souls-like, and I'll admit I defaulted to this method more often than not, but you also have the option to parry, feather attack to interrupt critical strikes, as well as perform Thymesia's own version of the Makiri counter. Having these tools at your disposal, combined with the very fast-paced frantic combat, requires you to think quickly because using the wrong action could easily lead to death. For the most part, I do think that Thymesia's take on Sekiro's style of combat is actually pretty well implemented with its own unique twists and quirks. You get that same rush of satisfaction when, after throwing yourself repeatedly at a boss, you finally memorize their attacks to get your parry timing just right. I'll admit the game can feel like a parry simulator at times, but I personally find this style of rhythmic combat pretty rewarding compared to your average dodge-rolling Souls-like. Talents, which we'll dig into more later, are where Thymesia adds some uniqueness to these aspects of the gameplay, allowing you to adjust how you're rewarded for parrying and performing perfect dodges. This is something I always love to see in games as it provides players with multiple ways to approach combat, letting them choose a style that works best for them. Another one of Thymesia's unique approaches to combat is how it employs wound damage versus actual health damage. Enemies essentially have 2 health bars. Attacks from Corvus's primary weapon, his saber, will deplete an enemy's white health bar, revealing a green bar underneath that can only be damaged by Corvus's claw attacks. To actually defeat an enemy, you'll need to deplete their green wound bar. However, if you stop attacking for a short amount of time, the enemy's white health bar will start to regenerate, so you need to remain aggressive to dispatch enemies as quickly and efficiently as possible. This does make for an interesting twist to your average Souls-like combat. It might make it sound like encounters are more arduous because you need to essentially eat through 2 health bars, but swapping back and forth between primary attacks and claw attacks does feel pretty fluid. Not to mention, enemies themselves don't exactly have a surplus of health anyway, aside from the tougher elite enemies. Of course, I can't speak about combat without mentioning Thymesia's plague weapon system. Aside from your saber attacks and claw attacks, Corvus has an arsenal of over 20 unique plague weapons to choose from. This can range from a simple spear or axe to some icky tentacles or a massive greatsword. You can equip up to 2 plague weapons at a time, and each one has 2 unique attacks you can utilize at the cost of energy. What I think is even cooler is that you can equip another temporary plague weapon you can steal from enemies for a one-time use. I thought this made combat encounters far more interesting as it adds another layer of dynamicness, if that's even a word, to every fight. If you see an enemy holding a weapon you like, well, you're free to steal it and immediately use it on them, or save it for later when you think it might be useful. It also lets you test run plague weapons you may not have unlocked yet. Although the enemies you'll be stealing weapons from do lack some serious variety. No matter what zone you're in, you'll be facing the same plagued soldier enemies over and over and over again. Thymesia definitely does fall short in this department, as it contributed to making some of the staler zones even more stale, but they do slightly make up for this with the elite enemies. These enemies are much tougher than the standard ones you'll encounter, and they always drop some sort of useful item for upgrading Corvus's weapons or potions. They do provide a decent level of challenge though, as I found myself emptying out my potions whenever I encountered one. Also, because they drop useful items, you're sort of encouraged to seek them out in every zone, adding some level of exploration for each mission. The bosses though are pretty hit and miss. There are some actually impressive, thrilling boss fights like the first one against Odur. He's aggressive, but his attacks are fairly well telegraphed, forcing you to memorize their patterns through parrying and the occasional feather attack. It took me many attempts to finally best this guy, but at no point did I actually think this boss was unfair. I genuinely had a good time getting whooped while learning his attacks. The same applies to Erd, a later game boss who's extremely quick and has very few openings for attack in her second phase, aside from a well-timed feather attack. It probably took me a few hours to finally beat her, but I had a blast in every attempt, as I did my best to keep up with her speed and parry her very swift strikes. On the other hand, there are some downright horrendous gimmick bosses like the God of the Fools, who is essentially a worse version of the Ancient Wyvern from Dark Souls 3. You don't actually fight the boss directly, you just cross a bunch of platforms while smacking meat sacks that spit out poison, also you can get to the top of the platform for a one-shot attack. This was such a shame because I actually like the design of the boss itself. There's also the Sound of the Abyss, who's just a big worm that flails around and almost begs for you to attack its very obvious weak spot. Once that's done, you're free to one-shot the remainder of its health bar. Again, another boss that was incredibly underwhelming, but had potential to be so much more. Thymesia follows a very familiar system for leveling up. After gaining enough experience, you can allocate a point to a specific stat and gain a level. Although compared to, say, your average Dark Souls game, Thymesia is very limited in this regard, in that there's only 3 stat points to choose from: Strength, Vitality, and Plague. They're all pretty straightforward too. Strength increases attack damage, Vitality increases health, and Plague increases claw damage and maximum energy. This did feel kind of limiting, as it didn't seem like you could follow some sort of specialized build with only 3 stats to choose from. I just distributed my stat points evenly among the 3 and had no problems with Corvus feeling underpowered. But stats do have another role to play in that they unlock additional effects for Corvus's plague weapons. So you actually do need to take stats into account when picking which plague weapon you want to take with you. This makes it less of an allocate your stats based on what class you want to play type of deal, and more of a allocate your stats based on your favorite weapon. It's a much more simplified approach, which I think works fine as the game is pretty short, so there's really no need to spend a lot of time theory crafting builds anyway. There is much more customization when it comes to the talent trees though. This is where you can augment Corvus's various attacks to do more damage, perform more hits, or enhance his ability to dodge. You'll get 1 talent point for every stat point you spend, and I often found myself having to make some difficult decisions on which talents to get. This is absolutely a good thing, as it means most talents are valuable and can significantly change how you play the game. For example, there's a talent that increases the window that Corvus can perform a parry, which I found incredibly useful since I absolutely suck at parrying. There are also pretty crucial talents that let Corvus restore energy with certain attacks, allowing him to use plague weapons more often. And the best part is, you can freely reallocate talent points at no cost. I love this as it allows you to continuously experiment with different talents on the fly. I did find myself having to switch up my talents for certain bosses, and I was immensely happy that I didn't have to take the time to find a specific NPC or find a rare item just to change my build. One final note, and this is something that I thought was pretty neat, was how Corvus can upgrade his potions with additive effects based on the ingredients found throughout each zone. I'm just glad they added some sort of feature that played into Corvus's role as an alchemist, even if it's somewhat simple. Each ingredient has a unique effect, and you can add up to 3 ingredients to 3 different types of potions that Corvus can equip. If you pay attention to the notes scattered throughout the world, you'll find that they also hint that certain ingredient combinations can give you bonus effects like increased experience gain. This was a really nice touch, and like finding the elite enemies, gives you another reason to fully explore every zone to find ingredients and learn about new recipes. To wrap things up, let's take a look at what Thymesia did well and where it fell short. For the positives, Thymesia's own take on Sekiro's fast-paced, parry-oriented combat is mostly well implemented with its own unique flair. Side missions are actually worth your time, as you'll find plenty of upgrade materials and lore tidbits to boot. The ability to steal enemy weapons makes combat more dynamic and exciting. Talent trees offer impactful choices, offering unique ways to approach combat. Some bosses like Odur and Erd are incredibly fun to battle and show the developer's potential to create engaging boss fights. And upgrading Corvus's potions with various ingredients made for a fun little alchemy minigame that encourages exploration and experimentation. For the negatives, zones are, for the most part, very bland aside from the sea of trees. A serious lack of enemy variety adds to the blandness of each zone, making fighting enemies very boring by the time you reach the end of the game. Gimmick bosses like the God of the Fools and the Sound of the Abyss felt incredibly uninspired and poorly executed, and only having 3 stat points to upgrade left a lot to be desired in terms of build variety. Overall, Thymesia has a lot of potential. It's an impressive first effort from a small studio that got a lot right in terms of gameplay, but fell somewhat short when it comes to enemy variety, level design, and some boss encounters. If these can be addressed, I really think Thymesia could have a bright future as a series, with its own unique take on a tried and true genre. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support as I love making videos like this. So please subscribe if you want to see more, and thank you for watching.